for education to be the midwife of democracy, we need to be able to provide our students with the ability not only, and as I was saying before, not only to read the world, as we've kind of education's always been about, how do we understand the world through history and science and mathematics and music and et cetera, et cetera. But the most kind of critical thing, and I think this is what Dewey's talking about, how do we get them to make the world? How do we get them to write the world? How do we get them to be instrumental in their own futures? And we are giving birth as educators to that possibility every day, every classroom we walk into. How can we enable our students to be creative, to be kind of participants in this world?
Welcome to another episode of the Name It podcast. I am your host, Jonas Oganovsky. This podcast is all about exploring and naming the deeper meanings, metaphors, and insights underneath our guests' passions, projects, and professions. I sit down with people from all walks of life to find out what brings them alive. This is the third episode in a special series exploring the reimagining of education. Rather than prescribing answers or singular solutions, my aim is to talk to people from all areas of education to learn and explore with my guests emerging questions, challenges, and opportunities. My guest today is Professor Michael Anderson. Michael is Professor of Creativity and Arts Education in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney, and co-director of the Create Centre. He is an internationally recognised educational leader in school transformation processes. He has taught, researched and published in education and transformation for over 20 years, including 17 books and 55 book chapters and journal articles. His international research and practice focuses on how the 4 C's can be integrated using coherent frameworks to support leaders as they work towards transformation in their contexts. Michael's most recent work, emerging from his research and partnerships with schools, include Transforming Education, which he co-authored with Miranda Jefferson, and Transforming Schools. We talk about the pivotal moment that led Michael to become involved in transformative education, what transformation of education means in the context of our conversation. We talk about education as a midwife to the renewal of democracy in each generation, and how AI and other technologies are exerting transformational pressures on the status quo, and many other topics. Michael's books and how he communicated during our conversation struck a unique balance between a wealth of knowledge grounded in decades of experience with an urgent, inspired energy to help move education in the right direction. I was humbled and inspired from our talk, and I hope you are too. Please welcome Professor Michael Anderson. Michael, so happy to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on for a conversation.
Thanks for having me, Jonas. Really looking forward to talking about something that's pretty, important in where we are in the world.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I believe you're talking about the transformation of education. And we'll dive into what we might mean by that and what that could potentially even be referring to. I would love to begin by hearing from you, perhaps how you found yourself interested in the transformation of education, and if there was a defining moment that had you ask that question or sort of get into that and get involved.
Yeah, so I suppose it starts in a classroom about 25 years ago, really, when I was teaching high schools. I used to be a drama teacher way back when. And suppose what teachers have as part of their lives is kind of professional learning. And often this professional learning takes the form of going along to a day or half a day of pretty much the same kind of thing. And, it's what we call in the business a spray and pray, or a kind of drive-by learning kind of experience, where you kind of, you get a bunch of stuff. Sometimes you feel excited about that stuff. Sometimes it's great stuff. But the problem is that it doesn't actually kind of seep into your practice. And I suppose, to put it bluntly, it's a kind of a one-night stand when you need marriage. You need someone to kind of be with you for the long term. You need someone to hold your hand. You need someone to go through the ups and downs when you're thinking about how you might, transform learning or transform education or whatever. And so, that sort of planted the seed to think, well, there's got to be something better than that to help me become a better teacher. So fast forward another kind of 15 years, I'm now working at the University of Sydney as working in teacher education. Some of the same frustrations I'm seeing around me. And I've got a PhD student, Miranda Jefferson, who is working with me, developing a PhD. She finishes a PhD, does a great job, and ends up working out in Western Sydney. I bumped into her in the street and I said, "Oh, Miranda, what are you up to now?" And she said, "Oh, look, I'm working at a school, and you won't believe it. We're doing all this transformative work across the board." This is around kind of 2017. And so going to that school, I have a look, and the first thing I see is a room, like a really large room, about 90 Year 9 students working together. There's 4 or 5 teachers doing different things. So in one corner, there's a guy doing kind of a seminar lecture style thing. In another area, there's some other kids working on a project. In another area, there's some kids doing some artworks. In another area, there's some kids doing some deep literacy work. So anyone who's taught secondary, or anyone who knows a Year 9 student, knows having 90 of them in the room is kind of a nightmare usually, right?
Yep.
And so, but what was going on in this room was actually deep learning. Like, everyone was engaged, everyone, like, there was laughter, but it wasn't kind of, out of control. It was just an amazing kind of experience. And I said, to Miranda, typical academic response, "Oh, we've got to do something. We've got to write a book about this." And of course, then we did. We wrote a book called Transforming, Transforming, what we call it? Transformative Learning.
Transforming
Learning.
Education.
Now, that's the latest
learning,
one. So,
pedagogy and curriculum.
Yeah. So the first one in 2017 was called Transforming Learning. And so Transforming Schools. What am I thinking? Transforming Schools. But it was about transforming learning, of course. So Transforming Schools was in 2017. 2021 was Transforming Education. And what we tried to do in that book is talk about not this fad or that fad or this thing or that thing. We tried to bring together everything we knew as educators of long standing, of 30 plus years, to try and argue for a model that moves away from this idea that we've got a whole lot of words in education, what I call and other people call aerosol words. We spray this around, smell fantastic, but try and grab it, it goes away. So, collaboration, communication, creativity, critical reflection, those 4 particularly, aerosol words par excellence. But the problem is, if teachers can't grab them, if students can't understand them, if there's no strategy, if there's no kind of framework, there's nothing, you can't teach them. And so Transforming Schools was an attempt to kind of bring everything we knew about education from 150, 200 years up to the present day together to say, what does a school need to do to transform? And so Transforming Schools was our first attempt to define the 4 C's pedagogically, and then Transforming Education, which came out in 2021, was an attempt to bring that all together and kind of apply it to curriculum, values, et cetera, and we can talk a bit about that. So that's the long story sorry, that I meant to make it a short story, but that's the long story about,
Yeah.
how all that work came together. And from all that, we've built an organization that works with more than 80 schools on that long-term kind of marriage, I suppose, rather than a series of kind of insubstantial kind of connections, I would say.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. It's great to hear that sort of that origin story that brought you to that was the sort of the spark for you, that going from teaching to sort of seeing like, wow, it can happen like this is possible. Especially, I would say that's a good acid test is your ninth graders. My mum worked in secondary education for over a decade, and as well as having been a student myself back in the day, children at that age are really starting to develop and get through, they're starting to push back and really care about their social interactions. So to hear them, as you described, in the midst of deep learning in a classroom with all those things around them, is really hopeful and encouraging of what's possible. And it sounds like yourself and Miranda, it's not that it sounds like, having read the more recent Transforming Education, it really is, it's really full of that framework, helping people actually grab hold of these aerosol can words that, for a lot of teachers, I think you talk about statistics in the book itself. When asked and surveyed when it comes to pedagogy or curriculum, they'll often, there's a large percentage who talk about what that means and how they apply it. And in many ways, like in many professions, once you've gone through that training early on, it can be a lot harder to really put that stuff into practice and use it in a meaningful way. So since you mentioned it, and while we're at the early parts of the conversation, I will just do a bit of a reminder to people. So this is how I came across your work. This is the Transforming Education that you co-authored with Miranda Jefferson. And it's not just transforming education. Perhaps we can, in a moment, talk about what that even means for you. But the subtitle is Reimagining Learning, Pedagogy and Curriculum. And I would add to that, teacher education, learning in a broader sense, leadership within schools and the whole system. It really, if anyone's sort of listening to this and either curious about, they care about education and future generations, or they're a teacher or involved and want something that kind of makes sense of all those bigger parts of education, I'd totally recommend the book. Did you want to, perhaps we could talk about a bit of some terminology? So to transform education, how would you describe what that even means in a brief way?
So
not keep it brief if you don't want to as well.
I'll try and keep it brief. So transformation is what learning is, right? So when you're learning about something, you are transforming from one state of knowledge or one level of understanding to another. So the classic idea of the spiral curriculum is you're transforming your understanding constantly as you go up the spiral of learning. And when we're talking about transforming schools or transforming education, we're actually talking about the same process. We're talking about incremental change. We're talking about a revolution at evolutionary pace. So we're talking about how things iterate. We're talking about how things change. We're not talking about, kind of being a caterpillar and next day waking up as a butterfly. We're actually talking about a very slow, very strategic, very kind of incremental way of change. But in that change, what we're doing is moving from an education system which was built more or less for the, industrial age to the AI age. What is it that our students need in a world that is changing rapidly. And I mean, the latest iteration around AI, you can see it happening almost in real time.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you prepare students for a world where information is at their fingertips even more than it was a decade ago? How do you prepare them for uncertainty? How do you prepare them for volatility? How do you prepare them for are going on in their lives? And one of the people that we refer to in the book, in both books actually, Ziad and Sadar, talks about imagination and creativity being the only really feasible way to respond to those kind of forces. And I think what we're trying to do in this book is talk about, and in our work actually, is talk about what that might look like and how that might be possible. So transformation in essence is learning, and transformation when we come to organizations is whole organizations learning. And we argue the 4 C's lays the foundation for that. So collaboration, communication, critical reflection, and creativity lay the foundations for that transformation and that learning to occur.
Yeah. I really like that frame. It's not one that I'd sort of heard described in that kind of a way, that it's the transformation is learning, and it's something that occurs in that iterative way. I can imagine a lot of people, when they hear the word transformation, especially if it's mentioned in a conversation about their particular profession or career, they could think, what do you mean? Like, everything's going to be, the table's going to be turned upside down and the rug's going to be pulled out from under me. And but to think of it as actually just a natural organic process that happens at the best of times anyway. And it's, I guess it might be more about how do we choose to engage with a process that's occurring naturally, and how can we support it?
I think that's an interesting concept. I'm not sure it does happen naturally. I think change occurs naturally, of course. We change from one day to the next, we grow older, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in schools and many organisations, we are actually, the structure of them, the architecture of them is actually more towards the status quo, because there's quite a lot going for the status quo when it comes for organisations. It means that there's no disruption. It means that everything keeps going as it was. The problem emerges, and of course, there's no problem with that if we've got a steady state in our community, in our society, in the needs of our students, but we don't. And so I suppose what we would say is, like kind of any organic processes, catalysts are required to make transformation happen. So, of course, in schools, there's a movement called the school improvement movement, which looks to improve practices that are already there. So, how do we do the things we're doing just a little bit better? And I suppose we would say, well, that's not actually going to cut it for what we need in schools at the moment, because of the way our community is changing, the way our society is changing. How do we actually think about transformation and catalyze that transformation in a way that changes things sufficiently? And so I think it is more than just small changes or natural changes. I think it is getting in the middle of the status quo, looking at who is gaining from the status quo. If that's not the students in classrooms, then we need to rethink what's going on, because they must be, in my mind at least, the center of everything that's going on. So if there's other vested groups like politicians or system bureaucrats or whoever that are gaining from the status quo, or commercial interests, we've got to revisit that and say, well, actually, we've got that the wrong way around, and we do need to transform these places to serve the needs of the students in those classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel tempted to briefly almost move to the back of the book, Transforming Education, briefly. And then I'd love to come back and hear a little bit about some of that actual catalytic or supportive work that you've been doing through, you and others have been doing through that 4Cs transformative learning work. So to briefly take us to the end of the book, which is really where my eyes started to sort of open up, and I was really like occasionally kind of like cheering to myself, was just the that conversation of like, okay, there's these school systems which for multitude of reasons have served somewhat of purposes in helping to produce young people and students who move into a workforce in an industrial age, and it almost has that kind of factory what's that, escalator or something process to get them out the other side, having all the answers and being able to sort of be loyal or obedient to certain practices. So that's one thing. And then there's that question of, well, the world is far from the same as it was, as you were saying, only 10 years ago. And so there's that real need for students to not only be able to survive, but to actually thrive in this kind of world that we're already finding ourselves in, and it's just continuing. So towards the end, there's some discussion in the book around what's the future we want our young people to survive in. So is that uncertain? Is that complex, as you were saying before? And it talks about some possible frameworks to help people kind of get a handle on that and what might be important pieces of the puzzle to move us in that direction. And it also acknowledges the, I might get this one wrong, you can correct me, something about is it a tangle of the struggles that people inevitably come up against. So whether that's parents who understandably want their kids to, be successful and have a meaningful life after school, or if it's teachers or policy designers, which is all to give a bit of a rambling frame for perhaps since writing the book, or just when you're not sort of in the thick of it in your current roles. What do you see as the major challenges to some of that, to some of this early shifting or catalyzing towards a transformation of education?
So what we were talking about at the end of the book is the transformation tangle, and that is the tangle. So having worked with so many schools now, we see patterns in transformation, and one of the patterns we see is reflected in that tangle, which is there are really quick wins for schools. Like there are things that change in the first 3 months when the energy and the impetus is all there. It's great. So there's an excitement that drives change, et cetera, et cetera. But then, of course, the inevitable happens. Someone leaves the school, something changes, there's a policy change or whatever, and then things slow slightly, or the initial passion becomes less strong. And I suppose what we see in that process is the reality of organizational kind of rhythms, that, you start with something exciting and then it becomes less exciting, and then, then people start looking around for something new. But the work of transformation is long-term. And the problem is, it's what I referred to earlier. When we have this kind of short-termism in professional learning, these kind of, fly-by professional learning, which is kind of easy to deliver. It's cheap, but it's not effective. It doesn't work. If you're there side by side schools, as they actually deal with the pains and the difficulties that happen in any kind of situation, then that's going to be a more effective relational kind of ongoing way to engage with professional learning and engage with transformation. And I think, to your point, there is something really critical about being able to um, walk beside schools as they go through this practice. And I think the other thing that relates to this is that issue around status quo. The status quo is really powerful in keeping people, locking people into where they are. And so to disrupt the status quo takes an enormous amount of energy, courage, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've actually just edited a book with some of our schools called How Schools Transform. And in that book, what we try to discuss, and it'll come out later this year or early next year, what we try and discuss is the actual kind of day-to-day. What did people do?
Yep.
So, for instance, there's a school up in Queensland, St Eugene. It's a K-12 Catholic school. And they had festivals of creative disruption where they actually worked to disrupt what was going on in the school, but they brought everyone along with them. And that creative disruption really made changes. In other places, it's professional learning that looks more kind of systematic and methodical. In other places, it's coaching. In other places, it's it differs depending on the school that we're working with. But in the end, the process is only it must be kind of fitted around the situation that the school finds itself in, and so we're really looking to match the kind of process to the needs of the school. And so to do that, we need to kind of look at where they are, the status quo features of that situation, and kind of work towards a transformative process that helps them to kind of take part in that learning.
Yeah, and that's where it's great, because you could potentially speak to a few examples of that in that work that you and others are doing through the 4Cs transformative framework and approach. So what I'm hearing there is to almost tie it back to what we started with, that change is something that happens. Transformation often needs more concerted effort and engagement, and it's often around, and I don't like to use this word too often, but it's in context, that disruption of the status quo. And it takes a lot of energy and commitment from all those who are involved. And what I'm hearing is, of all the things, all the sort of experiments and new approaches that are happening in schools all around the place in their own unique ways, it's around the people within those schools, for example, themselves having a group or a collection of those involved to kind of support that process along as it happens. And it might also be some organizations or groups such as yours that can provide some of that framing and support, especially, I'm guessing, in the earlier stages. Yep. So
yeah,
keep going.
yeah. So I mean, that's right. It's kind of the earlier stages that matter, because you really need to sit down with schools, understand what their particular needs and their particular drives are. I mean, we use the example that human DNA, the analogy, human DNA is 99.6% the same. but that 0.4% makes so much difference. So schools are, pretty much the same, but there is that 0.4% or, whatever it is of difference that actually makes a huge amount of difference to the way we are, to the way we think, et cetera, as humans, but also the way schools operate. So it's getting in and understanding that 0.4% that makes transformation possible. What's the culture look like? What's the appetite for innovation look like? Where do the staff come from? What's the leadership like? All of those things are crucial, and yet kind of traditional approaches to professional learning, or that come in and kind of do a bolt on. Here's the thing, here you go. Take no account of that context. The context and the way that context is understood and applied is left up to schools to do the hard work. And let's face it, schools don't actually have enough time to think about all that and transformation. Often they've got to do front of them, which is the education of their absolutely crucial in how we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you be able to share, perhaps, obviously, you don't have to give actual details, confidential details, but perhaps a recent-ish story or something that stands out for you as one of those examples of that 4% that you're working with or noticing through the 4C transformative learning process?
Yeah, sure. So we work with a school in the Illawarra region in New South Wales. I won't name the school because I haven't got their permission, but it's a comprehensive school. So it's not it doesn't select academically. It doesn't select for performing arts or anything. But the reality is that this school was looking to do something different for their students. The leader there was keen to ensure that the students that were there were catered for in terms of the world that they were entering into. And also, realistically, there's a lot of schools around that school that kind of are competing for interest. There's an academically selective one up the hill. There's a performing arts one down the street. There's a lot of kind of different things going on for those schools. And so what we did with this school was to come in and have that very discussion, to sit down, understand the needs, talk to the staff, and kind of do a readiness checklist for transformation, to understand how ready they were, what their resources were, and how they might move forward. And so we then kind of developed a process, did some professional learning, did some coaching, and now 2 or 3 years down the track, there's been some significant changes in that school in the way that staff interact and the way that students interact. And it's also probably worth saying, it's not just in classrooms, it's in staff rooms, it's in P&C meetings, it's everything that a school does. So transformation doesn't only happen in classrooms, it happens across the school, because collaboration, communication, critical reflection, and creativity are as crucial to the way staff engage with each other, for instance, as it is kind of in the learning environment. So all of these things fit together. And so putting these pieces together means that we need to be able to work iteratively, methodically, and slowly to make that happen. And so transformation never happens in a month, and it was true of this school as well. It happened over time. And there's probably 150 stories like that. Some not as successful, some more successful, but the 0.4% makes the difference. But there's the rest, the common DNA of learning in schools, and they're the things that we talk about in transforming education: the curriculum, pedagogy, learning, all of these kind of concepts that, when unleashed, when used powerfully, can be incredibly transformative, and they change kind of people's professional lives because they open up so much possibility.
I I think of some of the responses that I might get when I talk to people about this recent interest that I seem to be going on and on about of the importance of education in the broadest sense, and reimagining it or transforming it. And I do hear people respond anywhere from scratching their head to saying, that's all very nice, but what happens to those kids who might be taught in a different way when they meet the if they're moving from secondary to tertiary, or from tertiary to the workplace, what's happening in those gaps? Are they sort of struggling when they go from yep, no worries. If they're struggling from going into the workplace after being in a unique and an alternative education environment, what might be something that you could say to those who hesitate in that way? Did that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I think so. So I suppose the point is that, for me at least, that all students are coming into a world which is different to the world that we may have anticipated, because we couldn't anticipate the world that we have today. I mean, certainly there are some things we could have anticipated, but the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of uncertainty, gig work, etc., etc. Those things were probably things that we didn't build schools on. We didn't have those assumptions in our heads. So, to the extent that that's a reality for all students, we need to think about, kind of in a kind of a reverse engineering sense, what is it that we need to start with to get them to a place where they can apply the 4Cs to these problems, that they're taught, not caught, that we are actually teaching collaboration processes, we are teaching creativity processes, we are giving students the tools of creation so that they don't just read the world, they're able to write the world. And I suppose what I'd say to those people that are kind of questioning why we need to do this, if I understand your question correctly, is we need to do this because the kind of way that we've assessed students, the way we've ranked students, the way we've kind of created this education kind of system, still ensures that those who have privilege, those who are kind of in the right suburb, with the right demographic kind of characteristics, do better than those that don't. We just need to look at kind of our first Australians. They are still disadvantaged by this system. So what is it that we can do to ensure that this system changes for those students? So it's not only can we be ready? It's not only kind of a neoliberal, can we be creative because we've got to make more things for more markets? It's also, how do we shift an education system which is fundamentally inequitable to so many of our students? How do we change that? How do we shift that? How do we make that different? How do we respect kind of the ancient wisdom of the people of this land, the oldest continuing kind of people on Earth, civilization on Earth? How do we make that fundamental? And so to those people, I would say there is a need for us to reimagine and re-engage with schools, not only because we need to make kids ready for the 21st century, but because we have a system that's fundamentally broken and has been since its inception, because it advantages the already advantaged. So that I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think that's actually as important as kind of readying kids for the world that they're going into, making a system that's actually equitable for all participants.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I just had this thought arise around a book, and if I get it wrong, I can put the correct title in the show notes. But something around being good ancestors towards the future, and the idea that we are not just stewards of the world up till this point, and the cultures and the land and environment, um, and looking into the future as well. It's sort of I just see a little bit of a important moment or threshold where we're really needing to reckon with the past of our own and others' cultures, and how we can live together in the present, and how we can also move as communities, societies, and a global species into the future. And we're really grappling with understanding it ourselves, and we want our young people to, because we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, and that they need to know A, B, and C, maths, English, science, geography. We're full of questions, and we're kind of wanting to, grow these young people who they can work with questions and work with novelty and creativity, and work together with those questions and challenges. And the current, I think the current state or institution of education, as you said, might seem absolutely fine for those who it's being built to work very well for. And so I think it's really, from hearing that response and sort of reflecting it back, it's how could we not be working to transform or reinvent or improve education? It's sort of, I find myself really energized by it, and anyone that I happen to talk to, I might be in a bit of a bubble there, but it's it's a big issue. It's a really important one, and my sense is that there's just more and more sort of rumblings happening across different schools, and that's some of that work that you and some teams are doing in supporting them when they're that 0.4% is at that they've come to that place of going, this isn't working, or we want to do something different. Yeah.
I mean, I'm mindful of this, the processes that are going on kind of in our community more broadly, like the voice debate that's happening in Australia at the moment. And I think at the base of that is actually a fantastic story about collaboration. A community gets together, a significantly disadvantaged and kind of actively kind of maligned community gets together and comes up with an incredible piece of creativity and collaboration, and then offers that to the Australian community as a way of progressing reconciliation. And so whatever you think of the voice, inside that process are those 4 Cs. There is creativity in there. There is a huge kind of creative endeavor in bringing it all together. There is massive amounts of collaboration to get a community, any community, to come forward with something coherent and thoughtful and engaging is an incredible kind of thing to be able to do. And it's rare. Then critical reflection, kind of thinking about what's happened in the past, but not doing it in a way which makes us sit still, but moves us forward, and kind of changes what's going on. And then, of course, the last thing is the communication, that it is kind of communicated in a way which is mindful of the people who are going to receive the communication. So, if you boil all of that down, these are the processes that schools need and students need to be able to do the big things, to make the big societal changes. And there's a bunch of things coming up for our students, the next generation, that they're going to need to do those things. They're going to need to be involved in those things. And the extent to which schools are teaching those things seems to me to be insubstantial. I mean, it is kind of an outrage to me that schools aren't provided with the support to understand creativity and teach it effectively. Because if it is that process which is going to enable our students to be innovative, and of course creativity is innovation literacy, to be creative in their jobs and in their communities and in their relationships, and they don't have that skill, we are disinheriting them from what they are born with. We are born with these things. And so for me, the voice is kind of a big example of what's possible when those things are understood and applied effectively. And we need to be doing that in our schools if we are to have those big moments, if we are to have those big changes, and if we are to be able to move our society to a place which kind of recognises all of its members, but also use them and moves on those things that we need to change.
It feels like a good place for us to start to wind up, and I'm very mindful of your time, but I wanted to share a quote that you have in the book towards the end. I think it's from John Dewey's work. Someone who I think was on the scene was it the end of the 1800s, or am I getting that completely wrong? Maybe he was born somewhere around the early 1900s, but that's beside the point. I think people can look up John Dewey if they'd like. There's just a quote in the book towards the end, and it just says that democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. What does that mean to you, that phrase?
Well, so John Dewey's born in 1859, dies 1952. An amazing thinker, and probably the father of modern education in my mind. Certainly, many of his ideas are still thought of as kind of radical, although in my view, they're not. They're just a way to make schools work properly. I mean, when we talk about democracy being born anew, I think we can see how it needs to be born anew in kind of some of the challenges that it faces. The challenges of disinformation coming out of politicians, that some politicians, particularly in the US, the challenges of people actually kind of participating and engaging in their communities and engaging in the democratic process. And so I think for education to be the midwife of democracy, we need to be able to provide our students with the ability not only, and as I was saying before, not only to read the world, as we've kind of, education's always been about, how do we understand the world through history and science and mathematics and music and et cetera, but the most kind of critical thing, and I think this is what Dewey's talking about, how do we get them to make the world? How do we get them to write the world? How do we get them to be instrumental in their own futures? And we are giving birth as educators to that possibility every day, every classroom we walk into. How can we enable our students to be creative, to be kind of participants in this world? And so when we're talking about democracy, on one level, we're talking about voting. On one level, we're talking about kind of turning up and engaging. But on another level, we're talking about how do we make this great collaborative kind of experience and endeavor, how do we make that real for our students? And for us, it is giving them those tools, and those tools begin, they don't end, but they begin with creativity, collaboration, communication, critical reflection, which when understood and when applied can help our students to be the makers of their own destiny to the extent that that's possible. And in a world where everything is awash with kind of with the uncertainty and complexity and chaos in some places, that is a gift that we can afford, we must afford our students. Because if we don't, we are not preparing them for where they need to be and where they need to go, not only in the future, but right now, today. And so I would say that Dewey's words are really a kind of a clarion call to educators to be mindful about providing our students with what they need just to not only survive, but to thrive and to make their world what it needs to be.
I don't want to add anything else to that. I really appreciate the passion, the research, the work that you and others are doing all around the place in different schools and different communities at different levels. I think in this future where, in this present, which is becoming our future, where kids are needing to be and think in different ways. I think there's some of the phrases that you also use in the book. In our conversations and people who are doing the supportive work like yourself, it's that real modeling and demonstrating of thinking in different ways and interacting and relating in different ways and coordinating, which I personally think is a massive part of that growing and learning that anyone does, is because they see it happening. And so more and more of these examples are really encouraging and something that gives me hope that we are in that right direction. I think there's a hell of a lot more work that needs to be done, but I'm really appreciate what you and others are doing into that direction. So I'd also love to, again, just thank you for making the time. I'm so happy we made it work today. Appreciate your time to come on the podcast. If you have any final thoughts you wanted to share, or sort of resources you'd like to direct people to, if there's people out there going, oh, I want to know more, or.
Yeah, look, I mean, thanks, Jonas, for the opportunity to discuss this work. I suppose I direct people to 4ctransformativelearning.org, where they can find more information about if they're in a school or they're a parent or they're a principal, school leader thinking about doing this kind of work. We lay it out there, and you can contact us through that. Of course, the books, if you're interested in doing that. But I suppose the kind of my final thought is the place to start with transformation and the mindset to begin with is not that it is impossible. It is possible. It happens every day of the week, and it is iterative. It's achievable. But you do need to make that first step. You do need to engage. You do need to start thinking about it. Whether you do it alone, whether you do it through reading the books, our books, anybody's books, Dewey, doesn't matter. It's about taking that first courageous step. And having done that, you never look back, because it is an incredibly, it's a career-changing experience, and it's a community-changing experience. And we need to be changing our communities. We need to be transforming our schools. And so I'd encourage people who are interested to not just think about it, but to do something about it.
Yes, don't just think about it, do something, however small. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed or learned from this episode, Please subscribe and follow on wherever you listen to your podcasts so you never miss an episode.